The arrival
He
in Dryden.
watches.
The jar sat on its pedestal like a reliquary, the murky yellow of the formaldehyde catching the fluorescent lights. Inside floated a human brain, larger than most, its convolutions swollen and curling like the knotted roots of some ancient tree. Students at Cornell passed by it every semester, some with idle curiosity, others with the hushed reverence of pilgrims before a relic. But to those who knew the story, this was no holy object. It was a warning, a reminder that genius, without conscience, can rot into something monstrous. That brain once belonged to Edward Rulloff, scholar, teacher, physician, philologist, and killer. Imagine a man so brilliant he could learn 8 languages in as many years, quote Cicero in the morning, diagnose an illness by evening, and lecture on the formation of human speech after supper. Now imagine that same man cradling a hammer in the moonlight, his knuckles white, his voice calm as he promises salvation before delivering death. This is not the story of a man who lost his way. It is the story of a man who believed his brilliance excused his blood. And it begins in the rolling hills of New York, in the year 1842, when Edward Rulloff stepped into the village of Dryden, carrying with him both hope and horror. A stranger among farmers. The Erie Canal had remade upstate New York. Once quiet farming towns now bustled with trade, revival tents, and reform meetings. Families raised barns in the day and argued theology at night. Into this climate of optimism and progress came a tall stranger, dark-haired, impeccably dressed, his voice smooth as polished wood. Dryden had seen its share of drifters, canal hands, with mud-caked boots, peddlers hawking miracle tonics, even a traveling mesmerist or two. But Edward was something different. His posture was aristocratic, his hands uncalloused. His eyes, piercing, almost predatory, lingered too long when he spoke to you, as though cataloging your every thought. He dazzled the town almost immediately. He quoted Virgil as if reciting a bedtime rhyme. He lectured on phrenology, that fashionable pseudoscience of skull bumps and character traits, to wide-eyed farmers who clutched their hats and nodded at his words. He prescribed herbs and tinctures with the authority of a trained physician. He even helped settle small disputes in town, his speech laced with logic so crisp it silenced arguments before they began. For a community hungry for culture, he was manna from heaven. But the more they welcomed him, the more they fed the thing. He cherished above all his sense of superiority. Harriet among his new pupils was 17-year-old Harriet Shutt, daughter of a respected local family. She was tall, graceful, with a beauty that was understated but undeniable. Hazel eyes lit with intelligence, laughter that drew people in. For Edward, Harriet was not just a student. She was proof that he could conquer more than books and languages. He could conquer people. Their courtship was fast and to many in Dryden unsettling. He was over a decade older, and his intensity often slipped into something darker. Witnesses remembered how his smile turned thin if another young man so much as looked at her, how his hand would tighten possessively on her arm. Still, Harriet was charmed. Here was a man who spoke of worlds beyond dusty farm lanes, of philosophies and sciences she had only glimpsed in borrowed books. On New Year's Eve of 1843, they were married. Snow blanketed the Shutt family farm, muffling the world in silence. Yet during the ceremony, when the minister leaned in to offer Harriet the customary congratulatory kiss, Edward's mask cracked. His face darkened with rage so raw that guests whispered later they felt a chill sweep the room. It was dismissed as nerves, the strangeness of the day. But Harriet saw something in his eyes, a storm she could neither name nor escape. The first signs of rot married life in Lansing, a nearby village, began with promise. Edward opened a practice as a botanical physician, tending to the sick with herbal remedies. Their home filled with books, maps, and the chatter of his endless theories. Harriet bore him a daughter, Priscilla, in 1845. For a brief moment he seemed almost tender, reading aloud by lamplight, sketching visions of their bright future. But shadows always returned. His temper flared unpredictably. His jealousy toward Harriet's cousin, Dr. Henry Bull, boiled into obsession. And when Harriet's sister-in-law and her newborn died after taking Edward's medicine, whispers began to spread. People wondered if his treatments healed or poisoned. Harriet, once enchanted, grew pale and anxious. She wrote fewer letters home. She smiled less. But Edward's grip tightened. He spoke often of Ohio, of moving west where his genius would finally be recognized, away from the gossiping dullards of upstate New York. Harriet resisted. Her family needed her. And that refusal was tinder on Edward's rage. June 1844. It was a summer evening, the air heavy with storm. Thunder rolled over Cayuga Lake, lightning sketching the sky in jagged white. Inside their home, Edward and Harriet fought again. He demanded they leave for Ohio. She stood her ground. She was crushing, peppercorns with a pestle when he wrenched it from her hands. The blow came fast, brutal. She crumpled, the thunder outside masking the sound of her skull meeting stone. And then silence. Except for the infant's cry. Priscilla, their daughter, wailing from her cradle, as though the tiny child understood that her world had just been torn apart. Edward turned, his breath ragged, the pestle slick in his grip. He moved toward the cradle, whispering words no child should ever hear. The house fell still. By morning, Harriet and Priscilla were gone, and Edward stood alone, rehearsing lies for the neighbors who would soon come knocking. The community would demand answers. Harriet's family would not stay silent, and Edward, so brilliant, so calculating, already had a plan. But the lake near Lansing was deep, very deep, and secrets sink well. The vanishing. The morning after Harriet and Priscilla disappeared, Lansing stirred awake under the thick summer air. Windows opened, shutters creaked, and neighbors stepped into the pale light of dawn. At the Rulloff house, the curtains remained, drawn. That alone was unusual. Harriet was known for rising early, for sweeping her porch before the sun had cleared the hills. When neighbors knocked, Edward answered. His shirt was tidy, his hair combed, but there was something off about his composure. His eyes darted. His smile seemed rehearsed, stiff. He spoke quickly, with the clipped precision of a man holding back panic. "They've gone west," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the horizon. "To Ohio. Family matters." Harriet wished to travel light, but Harriet's traveling basket, the one she never left home without, still sat on her bureau. Her jewelry glinted in its box. The cradle was empty, but the blankets were rumpled as though a child had been lifted hastily in the night. To anyone looking closely, the story frayed. Whispers in the cornfields, in small towns. Rumor travels faster than any stagecoach. By sundown, every porch and parlor was alive with speculation. Some whispered Harriet had run away, finally tired of Edward's controlling nature. Others swore she'd been seen boarding a wagon with her baby in the pre-dawn hours. But the most troubling whispers came from her brothers, William and Ephraim. They wouldn't leave without a word, Ephraim said, his voice raw with anger. Not Harriet, not with Priscilla. The Shutt brothers began asking questions. Where? Exactly in Ohio? Who was she visiting? Why no letter? Each answer Edward gave contradicted the last. Eerie, Pennsylvania, then Madison, Ohio. Perhaps even further west, he mused, as though improvising a tale on the spot. The brothers' suspicion hardened into something dangerous. Resolve. They would not let their sister's absence become another story lost in the murk of Cayuga Lake. The mysterious chest. Several townsfolk recalled seeing Edward the morning after Harriet's disappearance. He had borrowed a wagon from the Andersons, loading it with bundles and a large chest heavy enough to require straining effort. He had driven it toward the lake, alone, his face pale and set. When asked about it later, he claimed he'd been moving medical supplies, things too fragile to leave in town. But no one remembered seeing those supplies again. It was then that Cayuga Lake, dark and glacial, became the focus of suspicion. Men gathered hooks and nets, rowboats and crude diving gear. They dragged the waters day after day, sunburned and silent, pulling up nothing but weeds and stones. The lake was vast, 40 miles long, in places over 400 feet deep. A perfect graveyard. Still, the absence of bodies only sharpened the unease. Harriet and Priscilla had vanished into thin air, and Edward's story shifted like a mirage the closer one looked. The hunter and the hunted by midsummer, Edward himself vanished. He left town under cover of darkness, claiming he would reunite with his family and bring them home to silence the malicious rumors. But Ephraim Shutt would not let him slip away. Armed with little more than a wagon, a revolver, and the kind of determination born of grief, he pursued his brother-in-law across the state. Witnesses recalled seeing Ephraim on train platforms in taverns and boarding houses, always asking the same burning question, "Have you seen this man?" The chase climaxed in Rochester. The platform was crowded, steam hissing from engines, travelers jostling in the morning rush. Ephraim spotted Edward moving swiftly toward a departing train, his hat brim low, his gait purposeful. For a moment, Edward seemed to vanish into the crowd, but Ephraim caught the glint of his profile. That sharp nose, those watchful eyes. He boarded the train, searching car by car. Passengers shifted uncomfortably under his gaze until, in the final compartment, there he was, Edward Rulloff, calm as though waiting for tea, smiling faintly. "My dear Ephraim," Edward said smoothly, "what a fortunate meeting. I was just on my way to bring Harriet and Priscilla back to you." His tone was so composed, so persuasive, that for a flicker of a second, even Ephraim wavered. A dangerous performance. The two men traveled together to Buffalo, a journey steeped in tension. Edward spoke as though nothing were amiss, painting pictures of Harriet's joy, Priscilla's laughter, the family's comfort in their new Ohio home. His lies unfurled like silken threads, delicate and dangerous. But Ephraim watched him with unblinking eyes, knowing this man could charm anyone into believing the impossible. At the docks the next morning, in the confusion of boarding a steamboat, Edward vanished again, slipping through the crowd with the fluidity of smoke. By the time Ephraim realized, the fugitive was gone. The manhunt stretched on. Townsfolk dragged the lake again. Neighbors whispered louder. Yet still, no bodies. No proof, and without proof the law faltered. Months later, Edward resurfaced under a new name, James Nelson. He was in Pennsylvania now, lecturing, teaching, dazzling yet another community with his brilliance. He wore his intellect like armor, his lies like a second skin. But truth has a way of clawing its way out of shallow graves, and Edward's past, Harriet's absence, Priscilla's silence, was about to catch up with him, because this time the law had sharpened its teeth. Scholar behind bars, the gavel struck wood. The sound reverberated through the Tompkins County Courthouse like a shot fired into silence. Edward Rulloff stood at the defense table, tall and unbent, his hair neatly combed, his face composed as if he were not the accused but the judge himself. The charges were grave, the disappearance of his wife Harriet and their infant daughter Priscilla. But the prosecution had no bodies, no murder weapons, no eyewitnesses. Only the whispers of neighbors and the inconsistencies of a husband whose words slithered from one version to the next. Yet Edward seemed unconcerned. More than that, he seemed amused. The courtroom performance. The jurors, farmers and tradesmen with calloused hands, watched with a mix of suspicion and awe as Edward began his defense. For he insisted on defending himself, brushing aside attorneys as if they were slow students, unworthy of his genius. His voice filled the chamber, sonorous and commanding. He cited legal precedents with startling fluency, weaving arguments that danced between logic and illusion. He reminded the jury, repeatedly, that no bodies had been found. Without corpus delicti, he declared, savoring the Latin, there can be no murder. Every time the prosecutor faltered, Edward's eyes gleamed. Every hesitation was a victory, every stammer a proof of his superiority. Some in the gallery even whispered admiration, as though watching a master orator rather than a man accused of killing his own blood. In the end, the jury could not convict him of murder, Instead, they found him guilty of kidnapping, a lesser charge but one that carried 10 years in New York's grim Owego prison. Edward accepted the verdict with a bow, as though it were nothing more than an academic disagreement. A cell transformed. Most men enter prison and are broken. Edward entered prison and built a kingdom. His cell, bare stone and iron, became a study. He filled it with books, classical texts, dictionaries, treatises on language. Guards and reformers smuggled volumes to him, charmed by his intellect, convinced that even a convict of dubious past deserved the tools of genius. He devoured everything: Latin, Greek, German, Sanskrit. He sketched elaborate diagrams of how words evolved, how languages branched like rivers from ancient streams. He began drafting what he believed would be his life's great work: method in the formation of language. When guards passed by, they often found him writing feverishly by lamplight, muttering to himself in half a dozen tongues. They told stories of him explaining Cicero to fellow inmates, of prisoners leaving his cell able to conjugate Latin verbs or solve Euclidean proofs. Soon, curious scholars and reformers began visiting the prison. They came to see the paradox: a man convicted of crime yet possessed of a mind fit for universities. They left bewildered, even impressed, many remarking that his intellect shone brighter than any professor's. The irony was sharp. The prison, meant to punish him, had become his stage. The disciple among those who fell under his spell was a young man named Albert Jarvis, son of the undersheriff in Ithaca. Barely out of boyhood, Jarvis was entranced by Rulloff's erudition. He visited the cell often, learning Greek declensions, listening wide-eyed as Edward spoke of the destiny of language and the grandeur of genius. To Jarvis, Edward was not a killer in chains. He was a mentor, a prophet of intellect wrongly shackled by small-minded society. That devotion would one day make Jarvis Edward's most loyal accomplice. But for now, it simply proved that even behind bars, Edward could seduce hearts and bend loyalty like iron over flame. Seeds of delusion. The longer Edward studied, the more convinced he became of his own immortality. His manuscript, he declared, would revolutionize human understanding. Nations would rise to honor his insights. Universities would etch his name beside the greats. His cellmate once overheard him whispering late at night, "My brain will outlast them all. My flesh may rot. But this," he tapped his skull, "will be remembered." It was not a boast. It was a prophecy he believed. A door left ajar in 1856, 10 years after Harriet and Priscilla vanished, Edward's sentence ended. But instead of freedom, he was met at the prison gates by lawmen holding a new warrant for murder. This time, they charged him directly with killing his infant daughter. Edward fought like a scholar, not a criminal. He claimed double jeopardy, citing case law from memory. He argued that without a body, conviction was impossible. Judges shook their heads, but they admitted, reluctantly, that his arguments were formidable. The trial dragged on, appeals wound, through higher courts. And as he waited in jail, the inevitable happened. Edward escaped. The how was never proven. But whispers pointed to Albert Jarvis, now working under his father at the sheriff's office, still bewitched by the killer's charisma. One night, Edward simply vanished into the dark, leaving behind only books, unfinished notes, and a silence that chilled his guards. Edward Rulloff was loose again, but this time, he was no longer merely a jealous husband or fugitive scholar. He was something more dangerous. A man who had tasted the power of outwitting the law, who had convinced himself that genius made him untouchable, and he had disciples, ready to follow. The stage was set, not just for thefts and frauds, but for blood. The criminal philosopher freedom should have humbled Edward. Instead, it confirmed what he already believed, that fate itself bent to his genius. The year was 1858. He was a fugitive now, a condemned man who had escaped a death sentence. Yet wherever he went, New York, Pennsylvania, even as far as the Midwest, Edward managed the impossible. He reinvented himself. One week he was a teacher of languages, impressing school boards with his command of Greek. Another week he posed as an inventor, sketching designs for improved machinery. In Brooklyn, he lived as a quiet scholar, renting rooms filled with dictionaries, manuscripts, and stolen goods tucked neatly under beds. But behind every facade lay the same truth. His brilliance was a mask, and crime was the blood that greased its hinges. The Brotherhood of Shadows, it was in prison that Edward had met William Dexter, a seasoned burglar with rough hands and a knack for locks. Where Edward had intellect, Dexter had muscle. Together, they formed an alliance. And of course there was Albert Jarvis, the loyal disciple who had once studied Greek declensions in Edward's cell and now followed him into the underworld. Jarvis was no longer just a student. He was an accomplice, a shadow at Edward's side. The three became the nucleus of a gang. Their specialty? High-end burglaries, silks, fabrics, and luxury goods that could be sold in distant cities. Their operations were precise, almost military. Edward studied the architecture of stores, the habits of clerks, even the schedules of night watchmen, then plotted every move. To outsiders, they were faceless thieves. To insiders, Edward was the conductor of a symphony of crime. Brooklyn nights by day, Edward maintained the air of a scholar. He lectured acquaintances on the history of language, pored over manuscripts, and hinted at a monumental book that would change the course of human thought. By night, he planned robberies with the meticulousness of a general drawing maps of battle. Witnesses later recalled seeing him in boarding houses, eyes alight as he sketched floor plans on scraps of paper, muttering calculations about how long it would take a lock to give, how many footsteps a watchman took on his nightly rounds. He lived two lives so seamlessly that many neighbors swore they could not believe the soft-spoken professor was the same man rumored to run with criminals. But the two halves of Edward's existence, scholar and thief, were drawing closer together, grinding against each other like tectonic plates. The manuscript and the madness, if crime paid the bills, scholarship fed his soul. In his dingy Brooklyn rooms, Edward worked obsessively on his magnum opus, method in the formation of language. He was convinced it would secure him immortality. He spoke of it with the fervor of a prophet, a theory that would explain not only how words were born, but how thought itself took shape. In 1869, he saw his chance. The newly formed American Philological Association was holding its first convention in Poughkeepsie. To Edward, this was destiny. Under the alias Professor Lurio, he submitted his manuscript. Not only that, he declared he would sell it for the astronomical sum of $500,000. Adjusted for modern ears, millions. It was less an asking price than a proclamation. His work was worth more than kingdoms, more than lives. The association's response was curt. Rejection, no interest, no recognition. For Edward, it was a shattering blow. His dream of being hailed as a genius collapsed. But instead of humbling him, it hardened him. If the world would not recognize him voluntarily, he would force it to, through crime, through blood, the turn toward violence. Until then, Edward's gang had avoided murder. They were burglars, not killers. But rejection poisoned him. His arrogance deepened into something darker, a belief that he had been wronged, that society had betrayed its brightest mind. His crimes grew bolder, his patience shorter. Dexter noticed the change first. Edward was quicker to snap, quicker to pull a pistol, quicker to suggest that loose ends be dealt with permanently. Jarvis, ever loyal, saw none of this as madness. To him, Edward was still the master, the teacher. But others whispered that the professor was losing touch with reality. Foreshadow of the fall by 1870, the gang's attention turned to Binghamton. The Halbert Brothers dry goods store had just received a shipment of silks, expensive, portable, perfect. Edward studied the store for days, calculating entry points, escape routes, and the clerk's routines. He described the plan to his men with the same passion he once reserved for explaining the origin of words. The robbery would be their masterpiece. But masterpieces, like geniuses, are fragile things. One mistake, a single stumble in the dark, could collapse the whole performance into chaos. And when it collapsed, Edward would reveal what he truly was. Not a scholar, not a prophet, but a predator unmasked. On a humid August night in 1870, 3 men in masks crept toward the Halbert store. Inside, 2 young clerks slept above the merchandise, unaware that history's most dangerous genius was about to step through their door. The burglary would end in blood, and Edward Rulloff's final descent had begun. Blood on Chenango Street, August 17, 1870. The air in Binghamton was heavy, a sticky summer night where even the dogs lay quiet, panting in the shadows. But 3 men did not sleep. They moved like phantoms through the alleys. Edward Rulloff, William Dexter, and Albert Jarvis. Faces masked, shoes stripped from their feet. They carried with them the confidence of men who believed the plan had been perfected down to the breath. The Halbert brothers' dry goods store waited for them. Inside, bolts of silk gleamed faintly, in the moonlight like treasure stacked in a cavern. Above the store, 2 young clerks, Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs, slept in their narrow cots, pistols within arm's reach. Edward had promised his men there would be no blood. "We subdue them with chloroform," he'd said, his tone that of a professor explaining a lesson. "They'll sleep. They'll wake none the wiser. We'll be gone with the silks." But the night would not obey his script. The stumble, they entered from the rear, slipping into the basement where the air was thick with mildew. Jarvis carried the chloroform-soaked rag, his hands trembling as he unstoppered the vial. The sweet, nauseating fumes began to rise. Step by step they crept upstairs. And then, disaster. Jarvis's boot struck something unseen, a loose crate, forgotten in the dark. The crash shattered the silence, the sound ricocheting through the wooden beams like a gunshot. Above, Merrick jolted awake. He snatched for the pistol under his pillow. Burroughs rose with him, eyes wide. In seconds, the clerks understood. They were not alone. Chaos unleashed. The burglars burst into the room. Burroughs hurled himself at Dexter, fists flying, the 2 crashing. Into chairs and boxes, the struggle filling the room with grunts and splintering wood. Merrick leveled his pistol at Edward, but fate intervened. The hammer clicked uselessly. A misfire. The one thing that might have stopped the genius killer failed him. Undeterred, Merrick grabbed a heavy stool and flung it. It struck the wall inches from Edward's head, the wood splintering. For a heartbeat, the young clerk looked like he might win, raw courage against cold calculation. Edward drew his own pistol. He fired once into the ceiling, then again. A warning, he claimed later. But Merrick did not falter. He threw himself at Jarvis, striking, clawing, refusing to yield. Something in Edward snapped. His patience dissolved into rage, his logic drowned by the heat of the fight. He raised the pistol again, this time aiming true. The shot rang out. Merrick fell where he stood, blood painting the walls. The boy who had fought for his life, for his livelihood, was gone in an instant. Flight into the river, Burroughs, seeing his comrade collapse, fled. He screamed into the night, his voice cutting through the humid air, waking neighbors, summoning lawmen. Within minutes, bells were ringing, dogs barking, men pouring into the street. The 3 burglars fled toward the Chenango River, hearts pounding, the weight of the silks suddenly meaningless. They had crossed a threshold. They were no longer thieves. They were killers. Jarvis, bleeding from wounds sustained in the struggle, stumbled as they reached the riverbank. Edward urged him on, promising the water was shallow enough to ford. They plunged in, but the river was deceptive, swift, deep, merciless. Jarvis, weakened, was dragged under. Dexter, unable to swim, screamed once before the current silenced him. Only Edward clawed his way to the far shore, gasping, soaked, but alive, always alive. Behind him, the cries of the town swelled, men hunting, with lanterns, dogs straining on their leashes. The entire city of Binghamton had become a single organism with one purpose: to bring the killer down. The capture Edward ran barefoot through fields and orchards, the night air alive with the sound of pursuit. He reached the train station, hoping to vanish among the passengers. But when constables approached and asked his name, his reflex betrayed him. He bolted. That single motion sealed his fate. Lawmen descended, chasing him into a farmyard. He scrambled, into an outhouse cornered at last. There was no speech, no Latin phrase, no polished argument to save him. He was dragged out, bound, and marched back into town, his soaked clothes clinging to him like a shroud. And in the crowd, Judge Ransom Balcom recognized him instantly. "You are Edward Rulloff," the judge thundered. "You murdered your wife and child in Lansing in 1845. The crowd gasped. The mask was torn away. The genius had been caught. Back at the scene of the crime, investigators pried open the drowned bodies of Jarvis and Dexter. In their pockets, they found papers, letters, notes, maps that led police straight to Edward's Brooklyn lodgings. What they discovered inside was a chamber of contradictions. Stolen goods stacked beside dictionaries, false identities tucked among manuscripts, maps marked with burglaries alongside pages of his life's work, method in the formation of language. It was not just the den of a thief, it was the shrine of a madman. And now Edward Rulloff would face the gallows. The last performance, January 1871. The courthouse in Binghamton bulged with humanity. 2,000 souls pressed into a space built for half that number. Farmers, merchants, scholars, journalists from New York City, everyone wanted to glimpse the monster in spectacles. At the defense table sat Edward Rulloff, dressed neatly, posture regal, eyes bright with the same strange confidence he had worn the day Harriet vanished. To the unknowing, he looked more like a lecturer than a man accused of murder. But the air crackled with recognition. This was no professor. This was the genius killer. A trial of masks. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. The silk robbery. The two clerks ambushed, Frederick Merrick dead on the floor. Edward's shoe found at the scene, stuffed with cloth to fit his frostbitten foot. Eyewitnesses who saw him flee. Documents from his drowned accomplices leading straight to his Brooklyn den. It was a web of proof too dense to slip through. Yet, Edward still performed. He rose in the courtroom, speaking with the poise of a statesman. He challenged witnesses, argued finer points of law, and reminded the jury of his intellect at every turn. At times it seemed he was less concerned with saving his life than with dazzling the audience. He had always been a performer, and now the gallows itself was his stage. The plea of genius in. The weeks leading to his sentence, Edward made one last plea, not of innocence, but of importance. He petitioned Governor John T. Hoffman for a delay of execution, claiming he must finish his great work, Method in the Formation of Language. "If I die," he wrote, "the world loses a discovery, greater than Newton's." Some took him seriously. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, argued that the mind of such a man was too valuable to waste on the gallows. Others scoffed. Mark Twain, with his acid humor, mocked the idea by offering to hang a substitute criminal if it meant sparing Edward's brain, but mercy did not come. The governor's silence was the final judgment. Genius would not save him. The final walk, May 18th, 1871. A crowd of thousands gathered on the outskirts of Binghamton. Children climbed trees. Vendors hawked pies. The last public hanging in New York was about to begin. Edward mounted the scaffold with unnerving calm. He scanned the crowd as though they were students awaiting a lecture. When the noose was placed around his neck, he smirked faintly. "Hurry it up," he said, according to some witnesses. "I want to be in hell in time for dinner." The trap door fell. The body jerked, then swung, a silhouette against the May sky. The performance was over, or so it seemed. The autopsy of a monster within hours. His skull was opened. Dr. Burt Wilder of Cornell University removed the brain with careful hands. At 1,673 cubic centimeters, it was among the largest on record, second only to a famed German mathematician. Scientists probed it, weighed it, preserved it in a jar of formaldehyde. They found no deformity, no lesion, no explanation for the evil that had lived inside. It was perfect. Terrifyingly perfect. To this day, that brain floats in its glass prison, a grotesque relic. Students at Cornell still press their faces to the glass, staring at the pale folds of tissue that once schemed, lied, killed. It waits in silence, daring them to answer the question the 19th century never could. How could brilliance and bloodthirst live in the same skull? The Mask of Civilization, Edward Rulloff's manuscript, Method in the Formation of Language, was never completed. His theories never earned him the immortality he craved. Instead, his legacy became darker, stranger. He proved that genius is not a shield against monstrosity, that a man can speak 8 languages, read Plato in the original Greek, and still poison his infant daughter without hesitation. That intellect without conscience is not a gift but a weapon, and so the genius killer lives on, not in libraries, but in nightmares. Not in lectures, but in warnings, because Edward's story forces us to ask, how many masks of civilization still walk among us, brilliant and charming, their minds sharp as razors, while underneath the blade already thirsts?